They didn't speak the same language. They came from mountains separated by thousands of miles of ocean and desert. But when the earth turned to liquid and the sky turned black, a team of Filipino mountain rescuers and a squad of Pakistani soldiers made a choice that would echo across the internet. It began as a training exercise. It became a fight for survival. And the one photograph that emerged from the chaos didn't show the rescue. It showed a moment of such pure, unexpected brotherhood that when it went viral, people wept without knowing why. This is the story of what happened on that ridge and what it cost them. The journey would have felt like home if it wasn't for the dust. Not the familiar damp dust of Baguio that clung to your skin like mist, but a fine beige powder that seemed to find its way into every crack, every breath, every memory of green. Ernesto Ernie de Majiba pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the window, watching the landscape of northern Pakistan roll by in a haze of heat and rock. The mountains in the distance were not the gentle, sleeping giants of the Cordilleras, their slopes quilted with rice terraces his ancestors had carved 1,000 years ago. These were jagged, angry, impossibly sharp, teeth of the earth biting into a sky so blue it hurt to look at. He was a mountain rescuer from the Philippines, part of a contingent sent to the Karakoram range for a high-altitude exchange program, a gesture of solidarity between nations that, on paper, sounded noble. In reality, sitting in the back of a military truck with 7 other Filipinos, sweat soaking through their navy blue jackets embroidered with the logo of the Department of Tourism. A strange patch for men who spent their lives pulling fallen hikers from ravines. It felt like they were being delivered to a challenge none of them had fully understood. Beside him, Rico Solomon was humming a quiet Visayan lullaby, his eyes scanning the rock faces with a professional's calculation. Rico was younger, 27 to Ernie's 41, but he had the quiet, unshakable calm of someone who had grown up in the shadow of Mount Apo. He was the one who had convinced Ernie to join this exchange. "Think of it, Manong," he had said back in Manila, his voice buzzing with the same energy he brought to everything. "We show them how we do it in the Philippines. The rope techniques, the basket stretcher through the guava trees. They show us their big mountains. We learn. We come back heroes." Ernie had laughed then, a deep, rumbling laugh that shook his barrel chest. He didn't care about being a hero. He cared about his wife Luz, who had gripped his hand at the airport so tightly her knuckles had gone white, and his daughter, Isabella, who had refused to let go of his leg until he promised to bring her a stone from the top of a mountain. "Just a small one, Pa," she had whispered, her eyes huge. "So I know you were really there." Now the reality of there was settling into his bones. The military truck stopped in front of a low, sand-colored barracks. Men in crisp Pakistani army uniforms stood in formation, their faces stoic under the brims of their caps. As the Filipinos jumped down from the truck, their worn mountaineering boots crunching on the gravel, Ernie felt the weight of their gaze. These were soldiers trained in high-altitude warfare and rescue, men who considered the Karakoram their backyard. And here came a group of volunteers from a tropical archipelago whose highest peak was barely a hill compared to the giants around them. The lead Pakistani officer stepped forward. He was tall, with a closely trimmed beard and eyes the color of dark honey, set deep in a face that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the mountains behind him. Captain Asad Khan. He saluted, a sharp, precise motion. Ernie, who had never been in any military, responded with a slight bow of his head, a habit born from years of nodding to village elders. A Filipino liaison officer translated. "Captain Khan welcomes you to the Skardu region. He says you are the first Filipino rescue team to train with his unit. He is interested to see your methods." The word "interested" hung in the air, loaded with unspoken doubt. Ernie saw one of the Pakistani soldiers behind the captain, a young man with a thin mustache and a skeptical smirk, nudge his comrade. They were looking at the Filipinos' gear. It wasn't the latest. The ropes were coiled tightly, but the sheen was worn. Their carabiners were a mix of brands, some scratched, some held together by nothing but routine maintenance. One of the younger Filipino rescuers, a boy named Junjun who had only been with the team for 2 years, was still wearing a pair of brightly colored basketball shorts over his thermal leggings. Ernie saw the smirk widen and felt a familiar heat rise in his chest. Pride. It was a dangerous thing on a mountain, but it was also the only thing that had ever gotten him through the worst of it. Captain Khan led them on a tour of the facility. His English was precise, clipped, delivered with a formality that seemed to build a wall between them. He pointed out their gear depot, the communication center, the medical bay. When they reached the training yard, a series of ropes strung between metal pylons to simulate crevasse rescue, he paused. "We will begin with basic drills tomorrow," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to being obeyed. To assess your base level. Altitude is not a friend to those who are unprepared. He looked directly at Ernie when he said this, as if singling him out as the one most likely to fail. Ernie met his gaze. He didn't blink. He had been doing mountain rescues in the Cordilleras for 22 years. He had carried a German tourist with a shattered leg down 2,000 feet of slippery root-choked trail in the middle of a typhoon. He had dug 3 students out of a mudslide with his bare hands. He knew what it meant to be unprepared. He also knew what it meant to be underestimated. That night, the Filipinos gathered in their shared barracks. The air was thin and dry, a stark contrast to the humidity they were used to. Several of them were already feeling the first hints of altitude. A dull headache, a shortness of breath that made simple conversations feel like a climb. Rico was checking his harness, his fingers moving with the practiced efficiency of a fisherman mending a net. "They think we're soft," he said, not looking up. "They see the shorts, the old ropes. They don't see what's inside." Junjun, the youngest, was sitting on his cot, looking pale. "Manong Ernie," he said, his voice small. "What if we can't keep up? What if we make the Philippines look bad?" Ernie sat down heavily on the cot opposite him. The springs groaned. He reached into his duffel bag and pulled out a small wooden carving. A bulul, a rice god, his grandmother had given him for protection. He set it on the small table beside his cot. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low, the voice he used on the mountain when panic started to set in. "These men, they know these rocks. They know the cold. They have the machines, the funding, the uniforms that fit. That is their strength." He leaned forward, tapping a calloused finger on Junjun's chest. "But we have this. We have the mountains in our blood. The Cordilleras did not give us tall peaks, but they gave us patience. They gave us the knowledge that a mountain does not care about your flag or your uniform. It cares about your foot, where you place it. Your rope, how you tie it. Your brother, how you hold on to him. Tomorrow they will try to break us. We will not break. We will simply do." The next morning, the sun was a brutal white disk in the sky. The Pakistani team was already in the training yard, their gear immaculate, their postures rigid. Captain Khan stood at the center, a stopwatch in his hand. The drill was a simulated rescue. Ascend a fixed rope, traverse a horizontal line, secure a victim, a sandbag, from a suspended platform, and descend with it using a tandem rappel. It was a standard drill, one the Filipinos had done 100 times. But here, at 7,000 feet, with the thin air burning in their lungs and the skeptical eyes of the soldiers on them, it felt different. The first Filipino to go was a man named Domingo. He was steady but slow. He took twice as long as the Pakistani soldier who had demonstrated the drill. The smirks returned. Then it was Rico's turn. He moved like water, flowing from one piece of gear to the next, his movements economical, almost lazy. He was faster than the Pakistani soldier. The smirks faded. Captain Khan's expression did not change. When it was Ernie's turn, he walked to the base of the rope. He was not fast. He was deliberate. Each time he slid his ascender up the rope, he paused, his weight settled, his breathing controlled. The Karakoram was not the Cordilleras, but the physics of rope, of gravity, of fear. Those were universal. He reached the platform, secured the sandbag with a complex series of knots that had the Pakistani soldiers whispering to each other. It wasn't a standard figure eight or a bowline. It was a knot his grandfather had taught him, used for securing heavy loads on the steep, muddy trails of Ifugo. It was a knot that grew tighter the more it was pulled. As he began his descent, the sandbag swinging gently below him, he heard one of the Pakistani soldiers mutter to another. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. It was respect. He landed softly, dust puffing around his boots. He unclipped and looked at Captain Khan. The captain's face was unreadable. He simply nodded once and wrote something on his clipboard. That night, the tension in the barracks was different. The initial antagonism had given way to a wary curiosity. During dinner, a simple meal of rice, lentils, and flatbread, the two groups sat at separate tables, but the silence between them was no longer hostile. It was the silence of two predators who had sized each other up and found something worthy. The young Pakistani soldier with the thin mustache, his name was Havildar Imran, approached Ernie's table. He held out his own flatbread, offering it. "You're not," he said, his English halting but clear. "I have not seen. Where from?" Ernie took the bread, breaking it in half and handing one piece back. It was an old ritual. "My grandfather," Ernie said, gesturing to the mountains visible through the mess hall window. "From the mountains there. Different mountains. Same problem. How to hold on when the earth wants to let go." Imran smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his skeptical face into something open and young. He sat down. Soon, other soldiers drifted over. Maps were pulled out. Gestures were used to explain the difference between the granite of the Karakoram and the volcanic rock of the Philippines. Rico showed them a video on his phone of a rescue in the Cordilleras, using a makeshift stretcher made from bamboo. Captain Khan watched from the doorway, his arms crossed. His eyes were not on the video but on the interaction. On his men laughing with the Filipinos. On Ernie, who was now patiently explaining the mechanics of the knot to Imran, using a piece of string from his own boot. When the evening ended, Captain Khan approached Ernie as the Filipinos were heading back to their barracks. For a moment neither spoke. Then the captain extended his hand. It was not the sharp, military salute from the first day. It was a simple human gesture. "Your men are skilled, Damajiba," he said. "But skill is not enough for what is up there." He gestured toward the dark silhouette of the mountains, the peaks now just deeper blacks against the star-scattered sky. "The mountain we will attempt is called Kilik. It is not the tallest but it is unforgiving. The weather changes in minutes. The rock is loose. It has claimed men who were better prepared than any of us." He paused, his grip tightening on Ernie's hand. "I will not risk my men for a training exercise. If I say turn back, we turn back. Is that understood?" Ernie looked into the man's eyes and saw not arrogance but a weight, the same weight he carried in his own chest after every rescue, the faces of the ones he couldn't save. "Understood, Captain," Ernie said. "But I will tell you now. My men are not just skilled. They are hard. When a Filipino says he will not let go, he does not let go. That is not pride. That is simply what we are." He let go of the captain's hand and walked back to his barracks. He sat on his cot, the bullo watching him from the table. He pulled out his phone. There was no signal, but he had saved a photo of Luz and Isabella, the one where they were both laughing, his daughter's small hand clutching her mother's chin. He looked at it for a long time. Tomorrow they would begin the real ascent. They would leave the safety of the barracks, the training yard, the easy camaraderie of the mess hall. They would step onto the Kilik and the mountain would decide who they were. He placed the phone face down on the cot, lay back, and listened to the wind begin to stir outside, a low, mournful sound that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth. He closed his eyes. Sleep did not come easily. In his mind, he was already on the ridge, the rope in his hands, the void below him, and the faces of his brothers, Filipino and Pakistani alike, blurring into one. The silence before a climb was always the heaviest part. Ernie had learned that decades ago on the muddy trails of Mount Pulag, standing in the dark with a group of strangers who were about to become brothers or ghosts. The silence here at the base of Kilik was different. It was higher, thinner. It pressed against his eardrums like a physical weight, and every breath he took felt like drinking air that had been frozen and then shattered into invisible splinters. The sky was still dark, the stars so bright and numerous they looked like a wound, like the universe had been torn open and was bleeding light. He stood with his team, their 7 faces illuminated by the cold glow of headlamps, their breath pluming in the pre-dawn air. Beside them, Captain Khan's squad of 8 Pakistani soldiers stood in perfect formation, their gear packed with military precision, their faces set in masks of calm determination. There were no smirks this morning. The joking from the mess hall was gone. The mountain had a way of stripping away everything that was not necessary, and here at the threshold all that remained was the work. Rico was beside Ernie, checking and rechecking the coil of rope across his chest. It was a bright orange rope, the one they had brought from home, the one that had pulled 16 people back from the edge of death in the Cordilleras. Rico touched it like a prayer, his fingers tracing the weave. Junjun stood behind them, his young face pale but his jaw set. He had exchanged his basketball shorts for proper thermal pants, a small concession that spoke volumes. Ernie had watched him the night before, sitting on his cot, studying the topographical map of Kilik that Captain Khan had provided, tracing the route with his fingertip over and over until Ernie had to tell him to sleep. The boy was scared and that was good. Fear kept you honest on a mountain. Fear made you check your knots twice, made you test every foothold, made you listen to the small voice that whispered when something was wrong. The men who were not scared were the ones who fell. Captain Khan walked down the line, speaking quietly to each of his men. When he reached Ernie he stopped. In his hand he held a small radio, the lifeline to base camp. "The forecast is holding," he said, his voice low, meant only for Ernie. "Clear skies until late afternoon. We should reach Camp 1 by midday, assess conditions for the summit push tomorrow." He paused, looking up at the mountain. Kilik rose before them, a massive shoulder of gray rock and blue ice, its summit still hidden in darkness. It was not a technical climb by the standards of these giants, but the approach was a labyrinth of shifting scree fields and crevasses, a path that demanded constant attention. I will lead the first rope team. You will take the rear. If anyone falls behind, you signal me immediately. We do not leave anyone alone on this mountain. Ernie nodded. It was the same rule he lived by. No man walks alone. The first light of dawn touched the highest peaks as they began to move. The column snaked up the initial slope, a line of ants crawling up the flank of a sleeping beast. The pace was steady, deliberate. Captain Khan set a rhythm that was punishing in its consistency: 30 minutes of climbing, 10 minutes of rest, the cycle repeating like a mechanical heart. The Filipinos fell into it easily. The Cordilleras had taught them the economy of movement, the way to place each foot so that no energy was wasted, to breathe in a pattern that fed the muscles without starving the brain. Within the first hour, the landscape had transformed from the dusty base to a world of gray rock and patches of ancient snow that glowed blue in the morning light. The air grew thinner, but the Filipinos had been acclimatizing for days, their bodies slowly adapting to the altitude. Ernie could feel it in his temples, a dull throb that came and went, but his legs were strong, his lungs working like the bellows his father had used in his blacksmith shop. By mid-morning they reached the first technical section, a steep couloir of loose rock that funneled up toward a narrow ridge. Captain Khan halted the column and called Ernie forward. The two men stood side by side looking up at the chute. "This is where it becomes real," Khan said. "The rock here is like sugar. You cannot trust it. One wrong step and you take yourself and anyone below you down." Ernie studied the slope. In the Cordilleras they had trails like this, but they were slick with mud and moss, not loose with shattered stone. The principle was the same. Distribute your weight. Move one limb at a time. Never put your full weight on anything until you have tested it 3 times. "I will go first," Ernie said. "My men know how to follow this kind of ground. Your men can watch, learn." Khan's eyes narrowed for a moment, a flicker of his old pride surfacing, but he nodded. He was a soldier. He knew the value of letting the right man lead when the terrain demanded it. Ernie stepped onto the couloir. The rock shifted immediately under his boot, a small cascade of pebbles skittering down the slope. He froze, let his weight settle, tested again. This time he found a small edge that held. He moved slowly, deliberately, placing each foot with the care of a man walking through a minefield. Behind him, the rest of the team began to follow, spacing themselves out to avoid the chain reaction of a fall. He could hear Rico behind him, speaking softly to Junjun, guiding his feet. He could hear the Pakistani soldiers, their breathing heavy, their boots scraping for purchase. Halfway up, a sharp crack echoed off the rock walls. Ernie turned his head slowly. Below him, one of the Pakistani soldiers, a young man named Faraz, had stepped on a large slab that had broken free. The slab was sliding, slowly at first, then faster, and Faraz was going with it, his arms windmilling, his face a mask of sudden terror. There was a shout from somewhere, a sharp command in Urdu. Time did not slow down. That was a lie people told. Time became very fast, too fast, a blur of motion that the mind had to process in fragments. Ernie saw the rope connecting Faraz to the man ahead of him go taut. He saw the man ahead, Havildar Imran, brace himself against a rock outcrop, his muscles straining, his teeth bared. He saw the slab continue its slide, now carrying Faraz's lower body, his legs scrambling for purchase that was not there. Ernie did not think. He moved. He reversed 2 steps down the couloir, his body pressed against the rock and grabbed the rope that connected him to Rico. With a quick motion, he unclipped it and clipped himself directly to the fixed line that Khan had anchored earlier. Then he reached out. His hand closed on the back of Faraz's harness, just as the young soldier's feet went completely off the rock. For a moment, Faraz was suspended, his full weight hanging from Ernie's grip, the rope above them both singing with tension. Ernie's shoulders screamed. His feet, still wedged in the shifting rock, began to slide. But he held. He held because his grandfather had taught him that a man's grip was the last thing to go. He held because he had held onto a father and son in a flash flood in the Cagayan Valley, his fingers locked around their wrists for 45 minutes until help came. He held because the alternative was not something his mind would allow. Then Imran was there, one hand on the rope, the other reaching down. Then Rico sliding past Ernie, his own body a brace against the rock. Together they pulled Faraz back onto the slope. The young soldier collapsed against the rock, his chest heaving, his eyes wide and wet. Ernie knelt beside him, one hand on his shoulder, speaking in the slow, calm voice he used for the panicked. "You're okay. You're okay. Breathe. Slow. Good." He did not know if Faraz understood the words, but he understood the tone. The human voice, when it is steady, is the most powerful anchor there is. After a long minute, Faraz nodded, his breathing slowing, the color returning to his face. Ernie helped him to his feet, checked his harness, checked his rope. Everything was intact. The mountain had tested them, and for this moment they had passed. The rest of the couloir was climbed in silence. When they emerged onto the ridge, the world opened up beneath them. A sea of peaks stretched to the horizon, their white summits floating on a carpet of clouds. It was the kind of view that made you forget, for a moment, the cold and the fear and the weight of the pack on your back. But Ernie did not forget. He looked at Captain Khan, who had watched the entire rescue from above, his face unreadable. Khan walked over to Ernie and, without a word, placed his hand on Ernie's shoulder. It was not a handshake. It was something older, something that transcended rank and nationality. It was the acknowledgement of one man who had risked his life for another. Ernie nodded once, and the moment passed. They set up Camp 1 on a flat shelf of rock just below the ridge, a collection of small tents that seemed impossibly fragile against the vastness around them. The wind picked up in the afternoon, a constant, keening whistle that rattled the tent fabric and stole the warmth from any exposed skin. Inside the small tent he shared with Rico and Junjun, Ernie boiled water for tea. The stove hissed, a small blue flame that was the only source of heat. Junjun was quiet, his hands wrapped around his knees, staring at the tent wall. Rico was checking the rope again, the orange rope, running it through his fingers looking for phrase. Manong, Junjun said finally, his voice barely audible over the wind. When Faraz fell. You moved so fast. You didn't even think. Ernie poured the hot water into 3 cups, the steam rising to the roof of the tent. I thought, he said. I thought, my hand is going to grab him. That was the only thought I needed. Junjun looked at him, his young face trying to understand something that could not be explained in words. But what if you had fallen too? What if the rope broke? What if? Ernie held up his hand. Junjun. In our work there is no what if. There is only what is. What was in front of me was a man falling. What was in my hand was a rope. What was in my heart was the memory of every person who ever held on to me. That is enough. That must always be enough. Later that night, Ernie stepped out of the tent. The wind had died, and the cold was now a thing of absolute stillness, so sharp it felt like the air itself had turned to crystal. The stars were the same as before, impossibly bright, impossibly far. He walked a few paces from the tents, his boots crunching on the frozen scree, and found Captain Khan sitting on a rock, looking out at the darkness. The captain did not turn when Ernie approached. He simply shifted slightly, making room on the rock. Ernie sat beside him. For a long time neither spoke. Then Khan pointed to a cluster of stars low on the horizon. My son, he said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. When he was small he would ask me to point out the brightest star. He believed it was a hole in the sky, that if you climbed high enough, you could reach through and touch whatever was on the other side. He paused. I told him I would find that star for him one day. Bring it back. Ernie looked at the stars. He thought of Isabella, her small hand clutching his leg, her voice asking for a stone from the top of a mountain. We carry them with us, Ernie said. Not in our hands. In here. He touched his chest. They are the reason we do not let go. Khan turned to look at him, and in the starlight, his eyes were not the eyes of a soldier. They were the eyes of a father, the same as Ernie's, the same as any man who had ever left home to go into the cold and the dark. The next morning the summit push was called off. The forecast had changed. A storm was coming, faster than predicted, a wall of cloud and wind that was already painting the western sky a bruised purple. Captain Khan made the decision without hesitation, his voice sharp over the radio as he conferred with base camp. We descend. Now. There was no argument. The climbers who understood the mountains knew that the summit was a privilege, not a right, and that the only true victory was coming home. They broke camp in a flurry of efficient movement, tents folded, gear packed, ropes coiled. The storm was visible now, a dark curtain sweeping across the valley below them, eating the light, devouring the world piece by piece. They began the descent, moving faster now, the safety of base camp a distant promise. But the mountain was not done with them. Halfway down the couloir, the first snow began to fall. It was not the gentle snow of postcards, but small, hard pellets driven by a wind that seemed to come from every direction at once. Visibility dropped to nothing. The world became a white void, the rocks and the sky and the ground all blending into one featureless expanse. The columns slowed, the men moving by touch and memory, their headlamps casting useless circles of light against the swirling whiteness. Ernie was at the rear again, his hand on the rope, his eyes straining to see Rico ahead of him. The wind screamed, a sound that was not just sound but a force pushing against them, trying to peel them off the mountain. Then, through the white, a voice. Not from the team. A voice from somewhere below, to the left, off the intended path. It was shouting, the words lost in the wind, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a cry for help. Ernie stopped. He turned his head, trying to pinpoint the direction. The voice came again, weaker now, swallowed almost immediately by the storm. He looked ahead, but the rest of the team had disappeared into the white, the rope connecting them now a faint orange line fading into nothing. He had a choice. Follow the rope, stay with his team, stay safe. Or go toward the voice, into the unknown, into the storm. He looked at the rope in his hand. He thought of the voice. He thought of his grandfather's knot, the one that only grew tighter the more it was pulled. He unclipped from the main line. The decision to unclip took less than a second, but the weight of it would settle into Ernie's bones for the rest of his life. He had made choices like this before, on mountains in the Cordilleras, on flooded trails, on the edge of landslides where the difference between life and death was measured in the space between heartbeats. Each time he had chosen to go toward the voice, toward the hand reaching out, toward the person the world had decided to leave behind. But those times, he had been on his own ground, in mountains he knew like the lines on his own palms, with the language of the land flowing through him like blood. Here, in the screaming white heart of the Karakoram, with the storm erasing the world around him, he was a stranger. He was a man from the tropics standing on rock that did not know him, under a sky that owed him nothing. And still he went. He took 3 steps off the main path before the rope went taut behind him. Rico. He had forgotten for a single moment that he was connected to others. The orange line pulled tight across his chest, and he turned to see Rico's silhouette emerging from the storm, his face a mask of disbelief and fear. Manong, what are you doing? Rico's voice was barely audible over the wind, the words torn from his mouth and scattered into the white. Ernie pointed into the void, toward where the voice had come from. Someone. Down there. In the storm. Rico shook his head violently, his whole body rejecting the idea. The captain said we descend. We stay together. The storm. Ernie grabbed Rico's arm, pulling him close so their hoods touched. Rico. You heard it. I know you heard it. A voice. Alone. If it was you, if it was Jun, if it was any of our brothers, would you want the man on the rope to walk away? Rico's face twisted, caught between the duty of the team and the pull of something deeper, something that had brought them both to this work in the first place. He closed his eyes for a long moment, and when he opened them, the decision was made. He unclipped from the main line too. They moved together, a single unit now, connected by the orange rope that had seen so much. Ernie led, his hands out in front of him, feeling the air for any break in the white. The wind shifted direction constantly, first screaming into their faces, then slamming into their backs, then swirling around them in eddies that made it impossible to tell which way was down and which way was up. The ground beneath their feet changed with every step, rock, then ice, then loose scree that slid away under their weight, then more rock, all of it hidden under a fresh layer of snow that was already ankle-deep and rising. The voice came again, closer this time, but weaker. It was not shouting anymore. It was something else, something that sounded almost like a prayer or a goodbye. Ernie pushed harder, his legs burning, his lungs screaming for air that was too thin to satisfy them. He called out into the storm, a wordless shout, a beacon to let the voice know that someone was coming, that someone had heard. Then the ground vanished. It happened without warning. One moment, Ernie was placing his foot on what felt like solid rock. The next, the rock was not there, and he was falling, the orange rope snapping tight around his waist, the shock of the stop driving the breath from his lungs and sending a bolt of white-hot pain through his ribs. He swung in the void, his body weight suspended, the rope cutting into his harness, the snow and ice crystals swirling around him in a dizzying dance. Above him, he could hear Rico shouting, his voice high and frantic, and he could feel the rope shifting as Rico braced himself against the rock, his own body the only anchor keeping Ernie from dropping into whatever darkness waited below. Ernie looked down. There was nothing but white, a bottomless churn of snow and wind that gave no hint of how far the drop was. His headlamp beam disappeared into it like light into a mouth. He had fallen into a crevasse, a crack in the glacier hidden by the fresh snow, a trap that had been waiting for the right foot to trigger it. He hung there for a long minute, his body slowly rotating, the rope creaking under his weight. The pain in his ribs was sharp, a reminder that something inside him was broken or cracked, but he pushed it away. Pain was information, not a command. He reached up, his arms trembling with the effort, and grabbed the rope. Hand over hand he began to pull himself up. The muscles in his shoulders screamed. The rope cut into his palms, the rough fibers drawing blood. But he climbed because climbing was what he did, because the alternative was to hang there in the white until the cold took him or the rope gave out or Rico's strength failed. He was halfway up when the rope jerked again, a violent shudder that almost tore his grip loose. He looked up and saw, through the swirling snow, a figure at the edge of the crevasse. It was not Rico. It was a face he had seen before, a young man with a thin mustache and eyes that had once held skepticism but now held something else entirely. Havildar Imran. Imran had come back. He had felt the shift in the rope, seen the two Filipinos unclipped from the main line, and he had followed. He had followed into the storm, into the white, into the teeth of the mountain, because that was what soldiers did, because that was what brothers did. Now he lay flat on the ice at the edge of the crevasse, one hand gripping the rope, the other reaching down toward Ernie. His face was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, the blood freezing into dark rivulets on his cheek. He was shouting something, the words lost but the meaning clear. Take my hand. Ernie let go of the rope with one hand, his whole body swinging, and reached up. Their fingers touched, slipped, touched again. The cold had robbed them both of feeling, but Ernie locked his grip around Imran's wrist, the same grip he had used 100 times, the grip that did not let go. Imran pulled, his body sliding on the ice, and Rico, still anchored above, took up the slack, and together, inch by inch, they dragged Ernie out of the crevasse. He lay on the ice for a moment, his chest heaving, the snow melting against his face. Imran was beside him, breathing hard, his hand still gripping Ernie's arm as if letting go would send him falling again. Rico knelt over them both, checking the ropes, checking the gear, his hands moving with the frantic precision of a man who knew that survival was a thing that had to be maintained every second. The storm raged around them, but in that small space, the three men were a world unto themselves, connected by rope and blood and the simple, stubborn refusal to let each other go. Then Ernie remembered. The voice that had brought them here. He sat up, ignoring the scream of his ribs, and looked around. The white was everywhere, but now, with the crevasse behind them, he could see a shape in the snow, a few meters away, half buried. It was a figure, curled against a rock, a climber in a red jacket that was already crusted with ice. Ernie crawled toward the figure. Imran and Rico followed, the rope keeping them tethered. When he reached the climber, he turned the person over gently, brushing the snow from the face. It was a man young, with a beard that had frozen into sharp crystals. His eyes were closed, his lips blue, his skin the color of old paper. For a terrible moment, Ernie thought they were too late. Then the man's eyelids fluttered, and his lips moved, a whisper so faint it was barely a breath. Help, please. The word was English, but the accent was something else, something Ernie could not place. It did not matter. The man was alive, and that was the only thing that mattered. Ernie looked at Rico, then at Imran. They were three men from three different worlds, in the middle of a storm on a mountain that wanted them dead, and they had found what they came for. But finding was not saving. The real work was just beginning. They moved quickly now, the cold lending them a terrible urgency. The climber. His name, they would later learn, was Alexei, a Russian mountaineer who had been separated from his own team 2 days ago, was barely conscious, his body shutting down from exposure. Ernie wrapped him in the emergency bivy sack from his own pack, the thin reflective material crinkling as he pulled it around the man's shoulders. Rico radioed back to Captain Khan, his voice cracking as he tried to describe their position through the static and the wind. The response came broken, fragmented, but the meaning was clear. Hold, we are coming. But the storm was not waiting. It was intensifying, the wind now a solid wall that pushed against them, the snow falling so thick it was like being buried alive while standing up. They found a small overhang, a ledge of rock that offered a sliver of shelter from the worst of it, and there they made their stand. Imran worked with Rico to build a windbreak from their packs and the ice blocks they could carve from the frozen ground. Ernie sat with Alexei, holding the man's head in his lap, speaking to him in the same calm, steady voice he had used on 100 frightened hikers, on Faraz in the couloir, on his own daughter when the nightmares came. You are not alone. You are safe. We are here. Stay with me. Stay with me. He did not know if Alexei could hear him, but he said it anyway because saying it made it true, because the words themselves were a rope thrown into the darkness, a way to hold on. The wind howled. The cold bit through every layer, finding the cracks in their gear, the gaps in their defenses, the places where warmth had once been. They huddled together, the four of them, their bodies pressed against each other for whatever heat they could share. The orange rope was now a web around them, connecting them all, a reminder that they were one thing now, a single organism fighting to survive. Hours passed. Or maybe it was minutes. Time had become meaningless, a concept that had no power here. Ernie's ribs throbbed with every breath, a deep, grinding pain that told him something was broken. His hands were numb, the fingers stiff and clumsy, the tips turning a worrying shade of white. He could not feel his feet at all. Beside him, Imran was shivering uncontrollably, his teeth chattering so hard it sounded like bones breaking. Rico had his arm around Imran trying to steady him, but Rico was shivering too, his face gray with exhaustion. Alexei had stopped moving. For a terrible moment, Ernie thought he had lost him, but then he felt a faint pulse in the man's neck, a thread of life still holding. The storm showed no signs of ending. It seemed to have settled over them, a permanent white darkness that had come to claim them. Then through the wind a sound. Not the voice from before but something else. A whistle. A signal. 3 short blasts, then 3 long, then 3 short. It was the rescue signal, the same one used by mountaineers around the world. Someone was out there. Captain Khan had come. Imran heard it too, his eyes snapping open, a spark of hope cutting through the exhaustion. He tried to shout, but his voice was gone, nothing but a rasp. Ernie reached into his pack with fingers that would not cooperate and pulled out the emergency whistle he had carried for 20 years. He put it to his lips and blew. The sound was thin, weaker than he wanted, but it cut through the wind. He blew again. And again. The signals came back, closer now. Lights appeared in the white, bobbing shapes, headlamps that looked like stars falling out of the sky. Shapes formed out of the storm. Captain Khan, his face a mask of ice and determination, followed by 2 of his soldiers, followed by Junjun, the young Filipino who had been so scared, who was now carrying a coil of rope and a stretcher bag, his face set in a look that Ernie had seen on old men, a look that said I will not break. The rescue was a blur of motion, a symphony of hands and ropes and voices that Ernie would only remember in fragments. He remembered being lifted, the stretcher under Alexei, the coordinated effort to move him down the mountain. He remembered Captain Khan's face above him, saying something, the words lost but the hand on his shoulder warm, impossibly warm. He remembered Junjun taking his arm, guiding him, the boy's voice saying, Manong I have you, walk, just walk. He remembered the orange rope, still connecting them all, a lifeline stretched across the ice, a thread of color in a world of white. And then, after an eternity that felt like drowning and climbing at the same time, he remembered the lights of base camp, small and yellow and impossibly beautiful, and the hands that reached out to take him, and the ground that was suddenly flat and still, and the silence that came after the wind had finally stopped. He woke in a tent that smelled of sweat and antiseptic. There was a sleeping bag wrapped around him, thick and warm, and someone had placed hot water bottles against his feet, the heat slowly bringing feeling back in waves of pain. He turned his head, the movement slow, and saw Rico lying on a cot beside him, his face bruised but his eyes open, watching. Rico smiled, a small, tired smile. We made it, Manong. Ernie tried to speak, but his throat was raw, the words coming out as a croak. The others? The Russian? Rico nodded. He is alive. They took him to the hospital in Skardu. The captain says he will make it. Ernie closed his eyes, letting the relief wash over him. Then he opened them again. Imran. Where is Imran? Rico pointed to the other side of the tent. Imran was there, wrapped in his own sleeping bag, his face peaceful in sleep, his hand resting on the orange rope that was now coiled beside him. Someone had brought it down from the mountain, a trophy of what they had survived. Captain Khan entered the tent, ducking low to avoid the fabric. He looked at the 3 men, his